الله السميع العليم من شر نفسي وسيئات عملي وشياطين الجن والإنس. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله الأمين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا أمين الله في أرضه. صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله. السلام عليك يا بقية الله في أرضه. عجل على ظهورك. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. I seek refuge with God from every form of evil, especially the evil of my own soul, the evil of my own choices. I begin in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the one with all attributes of excellence, the one with all attributes, the positive and the negative, in the sense that you attribute something of excellence to Him, it's a positive attribute. Or you negate something negative that is not excellent from Him, that is a negative attribute. All praise belongs to God, Lord of all worlds, Lord of every contingent notion. It cannot come to be unless He gives it that push into existence so that it can be, as opposed to simply not being. He is the one who continues to sustain it so that it not only exists initially, but so that it can continue to subsist, so it can continue to exist. The need for a cause is a persistent need for a cause. It is not like turning on an engine where your hand only needs to move once and then the engine is on. It is like the continuous need the engine has for its parts that are allowing it to continue to move. It is like the way that it's not how a builder builds a home. He just puts the bricks and the mortar on top of each other and then the house is there and it's set. No, the house needs the bricks and the mortar to continue to be positioned in that way, to continue to last as that structure. It's a continuous need for that cause. Sometimes we misdiagnose what the real cause is. The real cause for the structure of the home to be maintained is the position of those bricks and mortar in that particular fashion. If you were to remove one of those bricks, you may find that the wall collapses. The sun and its rays, the rays need the sun to continue to exist. Otherwise, the rays disappear. The need for God is like the need that an effect has for its cause. It needs its cause at every moment, because on its own, it cannot maintain its own existence. Whatever is allowing it to maintain its existence, that is its cause. God Almighty is the cause of everything, the Lord of every realm, the Lord of every universe, the Lord, Al-Mudabbir, the one who is the Rabb, the one who is the supervisor, the overseer, the one who is the one upkeeping it, maintaining it, looking over it. I ask Him to shower peace and blessings upon the chosen ones, those who He sent to show us how to achieve our purpose, how to reach our potential, and upon especially the seal of all prophets and messengers, the final and the last chosen one, Muhammad. And I ask Him to shower peace and blessings upon those through whom He completed the prescription of excellence. He perfected the faith that He gave to us through the seal of our prophets and messengers. And those are the Imams, the guardians of His message, the ones who live up to the ideals of the message. In every day and age, there must be one, at least, one guardian that lives up to that message, that lives on to be inseparable from the Holy Quran, who never deviates from its message in word or in practice. These are the 12 Imams, and especially the living Imam of our time, the awaited son of Imam al-Hasan al-Askari, our awaited, the one who is waiting for us to be prepared, and we are waiting for him, for God to give him permission to make himself publicly known, the Imam of our time, Imam al-Mahdi. May God hasten his appearance. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The verse that we've been looking at to reflect on the need for reference to experts when we don't have access to the holy Imam of our time, when we don't have access to this blessing because people have either committed so many wrongs, so many wrongdoings, so many atrocities, or even the followers of the Imam may be having so many shortcomings that they're not living up to what is needed for those blessings to be reaped, for those fruits to be reaped. We need to refer to experts when we don't have direct access to the Imam. And even during the Imam's public appearance, he may defer us to the experts on different issues, just as it would happen during the time of the previous Imams, and was the practice of human beings, sound-minded individuals throughout history. As far as you can think of back in history, as far as people can remember, whenever you didn't know, you would refer to those who do know to figure things out. The non-expert would refer to the expert. The Holy Quran says, وَمَا كَانَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ لِيَنْفِرُوا كَافَّةً فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ طَائِفَةٌ لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُمْ إِذَا رَجَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَحْذَرُونَ. As one translation goes, yet it is not for the faithful to go forth en masse, but why should not there go forth a group from each of their sections to become learned in religion and to warn their people when they return to them, so that they may beware. What I've discussed in the past 2 nights on this particular topic is the need for us to have a very firm understanding of where we came from, where we're headed, what is the state of our affairs in this current world, and how do we make sure that we reach our destination in one piece: safety and security. It's been reported that our Imams have described the state of the people of the end times. It's been reported that Imam al-Sajjad, peace be upon him, our 4th Imam, the son of Imam Hussein, peace be upon him, he says, according to this report, تَمْتَدُّ الْغَيْبَةِ بِوَلِيِّ اللَّهِ الثَّانِي عَشَرٍ مِنْ أَوْصِيَاءِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ وَالْأِمَّةِ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ يَا أَبَا خَالِدٍ. That the time of the ghaibah of the 12th Imam, the 12th wali of God, the 12th guardian on behalf of God, from among the guardians, those trustees appointed by the Messenger of God, his ghaibah, his time in which he is not publicly known, he's in occultation as some translate it, or he's hidden as some translate it, or he is not directly accessible publicly as some will translate it. The ghaibah is a very interesting dynamic, and that's its own topic. It's a presence while in absence. It's an absence while truly present. And that has its own topic. But anyway, the Imam, according to this report, says his ghaibah will extend for a very long period. O Aba Khalid, he speaks to him. He says, however, Inna ahla zamani ghaibati, the people during the time of his ghaibah, al-qa'iluna bi-imamati, those who believe that he is the Imam, al-muntadiruna li-dhuhurih, those who are waiting for his public appearance, his dhuhur. أفضل أهل أفضل أهل كل زمان. They are the best of the people of all times. Why? He explains according to this report. لأن الله تعالى ذكره أعطاهم من العقول والأفهام والمعرفة ما صارت به الغيبة عندهم بمنزلة المشاهدة. Because God, the esteemed or the high in praise, the exalted, has given them, why are they the best? Why? Because God has given them such minds, such intellects, such understanding, such awareness, that the ghaiba to them, it's as if the Imam is already here. As if the Imam is present, even though he is in ghaiba. Even though the Imam is not publicly accessible, even though the Imam is not a public personality, for these people of this time that the Imam is describing according to this report, to them, it's no difference. They know the Imam is there. To them, it's as if they see the Imam. It's as if the Imam is right there in front of them. وَجَعَلَهُمْ فِي ذَلِكَ الزَّمَانِ بِمَنْزِلَةِ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ بَيْنَ يَدَيْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ بِالسَّيْفِ. And God has made them in that time and that age to have the status of those who would be fighting in defense of Islam under the banner of the Prophet. That they, as if they're standing right there in front of the Prophet defending Islam. That's the status that these individuals have in that age that the Imam is describing. أُولَٰئِكَ الْمُخْلِصُونَ حَقًّا. Those are the ones who are truly sincere. وَشِيعَتُنَا صِدْقًا. And our true Shia. وَالدُّعَاةِ إِلَى دِينِ اللَّهِ سِرًّا وَجَهْرًا. And those who call to the way of God, to the religion, to the faith, the prescription that God has given for humanity, in secret and in public. And it's reported that Imam said, انتظار الفرج من أعظم الفرج. Waiting for the relief is of the greatest form of relief. انتظار الفرج من أعظم الفرج. So this process of being prepared, preparing ourselves while we're waiting, proactively waiting for the Imam, it's one of the greatest forms of relief. It's one of the greatest forms of faraj that can come to us. One more report before I continue the topic, and these are directly related to kind of our incentive and our inspiration to be driven to follow the teachings of our scholars. Look, for example, what this report says. It's been reported that Al-Imam Ali al-Naqi alayhi salam said, that's a reference to Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, the father of Imam al-Hasan al-Askari, so the grandfather of our 12th Imam. So our 10th Imam alayhi salam has been reported to have said, لولا من يبقى بعد غيبة قائمكم من العلماء الداعين إليه والدالين عليه والذابين عن دينه بحجج الله. If it were not for those who remain after the time of the ghaibah of your qa'im, he's referring to the 12th Imam. So this is, according to this report, this is 2 Imams before Imam Mahdi telling us that if it were not for after the time of the ghaibah, when the answer of the ghaibah occurs for your Imam, the qa'im, the one you're waiting for, if it were not for the scholars, the ulama, however, the scholars in that very specific sense, that very elevated level of scholarship that I referred to yesterday, the ulama, who call towards him, call towards the 12th Imam, they call towards that qa'im, the qa'im you're waiting for. If it were not for those ulama, and those amongst them who protect and defend the faith, they protect the deen of God, through the arguments, through the proofs that God has given, or that God has made them come to know. بِحُجَجِ اللَّهِ وَالْمُنْقِذِينَ لِضُعَفَاءِ عِبَادِ اللَّهِ مِنْ شِبَاكِ إِبْلِيسَ وَمَرَدَتِهِ وَمِنْ فِخَاخِ النَّوَاصِبِ. And those who would save the weak among the servants of God, the weak among God's creatures, they would save them, rescue them from the nets, the traps of Iblis, Shaitan, and his other fellow demons, and from the traps of the Nawasib, those who hate Ahlul Bayt. These scholars, these ulama of that caliber, those who would perform these actions, if it were not for them, now the Imam tells us, what is it? If it were not for them, what? He says, if it were not for them, لَمَا بَقِيَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا ارْتَدَّ عَنْ دِينِ اللَّهِ وَلَكِنَّهُمْ الَّذِينَ يُمْسِكُونَ أَزِمَّةَ قُلُوبِ ضُعَفَاءِ الشِّيعَةِ كَمَا يُمْسِكُ صَاحِبُ السَّفِينَةِ سُكَّانَهَا أُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْأَفْضَلُونَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. If it were not for them, there would not be anyone left except that they would have been turned away from their faith. They would have been too weak to face all of these challenges. If it were not for those elevated levels of scholarship that those ulama had, that they would show them the proofs, they would show them the arguments, they would defend the religion, they would defend the faith against all of those different traps, then there would not have been anyone except that they would have turned away from the faith. I mean, at least this is referring to the great extent of those who would have been too weak to face it on their own. But of course, those scholars themselves, obviously it's not saying nobody would have been guided, because those scholars themselves had enough reflection and help from God and the intercession of Ahlul Bayt to remain steadfast. But anyway, it continues. However, they are the ones that hold on to the hearts, they hold on to the hearts of the weak among the Shia. Just as a captain of a ship would hold on, the captain of the ship would be able to maintain the people that are on the ship. Those are the best when it comes their status to God. Those are the best. Those are the ones with the highest level of merit. Those are the ones with virtue. Okay, so this type of report is giving us hints at something that makes sense to an extent, but at the very least, there's indications in the heritage of Ahlul Bayt, with the existence of such reports, that this is the high level that these ulama have. Now, what is the main reason why we refer to the ulama? The main reason that we refer to the ulama as the experts today is to understand the prescription of excellence for what we do and what we should not do. The do's and don'ts. What is valid, what transactions are valid, what conditions are required in other transactions that if they're not presented and they're properly performed, then they make it invalid. When I'm engaged in trade, when I'm engaged in buying and selling, when I want to buy any kind of, when I want to engage in any type of trade, when I want to engage in any type of contract, whether it be a marriage contract or a sales transaction, a lease, any type of transaction that I'm involved in. It's not only about our acts of worship that I mentioned examples of yesterday or before, but it's also about our various transactions in every facet of life. There is not an action or an event that happens in life that does not have a relevant ruling. Whether it's something to do that is allowed or forbidden or recommended or not recommended, or it's something of a transaction nature, or something that is regarding validity or invalidity. So it's something that's either correct, has the proper conditions, or it's incorrect, invalid. So how do we realize the rulings that are dealing with these types of issues? We talked yesterday about how there's a level, after we've established our understanding of the world, our understanding about God, our understanding about the prophets, the messengers, the final prophet, the 12 imams, the belief in a day of judgment when everything will be set straight and the records will be set straight, everything will be accounted for. When you realize these, yes, the scholars may help you come to see things clearly, but for yourself. We can't take their word for it when it comes to those root beliefs, those bedrock foundations of our worldview. That's something we need to come to with our own independent reasoning. The scholar, the ulama, the speakers that come to our centers, the readership, the scholars that write books and we become the readership of those books, all that can do is maybe help shed light for us to realize ourselves independently that it makes sense or not. For those bedrock foundations, those of our worldview, the usul al-din, as they're referred to, the principles or the foundations of the religion. That's when it comes to those beliefs. All the scholars can do is try to help us see it for ourselves. But we need to see it for ourselves because it's something we're responsible for. Why should we take that scholar's word for it? Why? Why should I? How do I know that he's on the right path? I have to be able to see it for myself. But when it comes to practices, when it comes to the transaction and acts of worship, when it comes to that expert knowledge that requires years of study, of rigorous scholarship, when it comes to that, we find that there's a different dynamic that goes on. There's something called taqleed that becomes permissible. But how do we know that it's permissible? I mentioned yesterday, we can't take the scholar's word for it because that would be circular. How do we know taqleed is permissible when it comes to those rulings? We can't take his word for it, that's circular. We can't deduce it for ourselves from the verse of the Quran because there may be other issues of expertise involved that require skill that we don't realize by just reading one verse, or we may improperly interpret the verse. So it's not through our understanding of the verse by ourselves. And it's not also by looking at the hadith heritage on our own, because that also requires skillful scholarship and rigorous study for years and taking back and forth, looking at the different arguments and so on and so forth. So it's an issue of expertise. So then how do we know we can follow a scholar, a alim, a mujtahid, a marja, when it comes to issues of our practices, the rulings, the fiqh? How do we know? I mentioned yesterday that the way we know is by the dictates of sound reasoning. When you don't know, your mind tells you, go to those who do know. At the very least, it's an innate inclination for us to do so. It's a natural inclination that when you don't know, you refer to those who do know. Either it's the dictates of a rational thinking, or it's the dictates of a natural, innate human inclination, or it is the practice of the sound-minded individuals in the community. When the sound-minded are asked, what do you do when you're not an expert in something? And you need to figure it out. What do you do? What do they say and what do they do in practice? They would say, and they would actually in practice, refer to those who are skillful experts and specialists in that area, regardless what it may be. Regardless what it may be, whether it's an academic skill or it's a technical skill. You refer to those who know better, and then there are signs that you look for to figure out whether somebody is really an expert or not. That's when it comes to things that you want to figure out and you can't figure it out on your own. You're not an expert yourself. You don't have the time or the energy or whatever reason, for your practical reasons, you're not able to become the expert yourself. And in some cases, either taking precaution is either impossible, or it's tedious, or you just simply want to do what is okay. And you know that following an expert is something very sound-minded, and it's a practice that people go about doing. You refer to the sound-minded practice of intellectuals, of people with sound minds, and that is to refer to the specialists. But you don't just refer to any specialist. You refer to a specialist who is one of integrity, one who is of upright character that you can trust. They are leading you in the right direction when they tell you about something, and they're not taking advantage of what you think about them for their ulterior motives. This is all stuff I've discussed so far. What's the next step? The next step is thinking a little bit more about what are the qualifications. What are the qualifications of such mujtahideen, of such maraja, that makes it okay for me to refer to them and for me to turn over the necklace of my faith and put it over their neck? the necklace of my own faith, the necklace of that prescription that I believe that is going to bring me closer to the Imam of my time, that is going to bring me closer to his mission, that is going to bring me thus closer to God, I'm giving it and handing it over to that reference that I'm referring to, that scholar that I'm referring to. And I'm using the word scholar here as alim, not in the very loose way that we refer to in English sometimes. I'm using the word scholar to refer to alim, mujtahid, marja. So if you hear me use the word alim, I'm referring here to mujtahideen, the maraja, the ones who are of such a caliber of skilled scholarship in Islam, in their expert houses studies, to give their own opinion where it's excusable before God. It's not just giving their own kind of leaning or their own conjecture. No, it's a skillful position that is based on years of careful scholarship. Step by step, covering their bases properly until they reach a conclusion that they consider between them and God is excusable. When they reach a certain level of that scholarship and ilm ijtihad, they may become qualified enough for people to follow them. These are the type of scholars that I'm referring to when I say scholar here. Alim, mujtahid. Now, what is required in that type of a marja, in that type of a mujtahid, in that type of a alim, in that type of a scholar? I mentioned adala, being upright, being one of integrity. So you would be able to trust them, that they're in line with the faith. They don't only believe in this worldview, they don't only base their lively decisions on this worldview, they're also committed to it, to such an extent where their reputation precedes them. Now the question is, can I follow just any one of those mujtahideen, or do I have to look for the one who is known to be the most learned or the most qualified amongst them? You see, there are many physicians, and for many of our acts in life, we may refer to just any physician. You don't really find it very common that we ask, well, is that the best physician? When you're just going to get your weekly or monthly or yearly checkup, right? You just refer to somebody who is a competent physician, who has testimonies, who has certification from a well-known university, who has an okay reputation, and you refer to that physician, right? That's because perhaps generally those physicians are not going to disagree on the very basics of diagnosis and prescriptions that are based on that diagnosis for the typical types of things that people may face. However, what about when it comes to things where there are clear differences of opinion amongst the experts? Different physicians have different takes on how to diagnose certain things or how to deal with certain types of illnesses. In those cases, do you start to worry about who has the best reputation, who is the most qualified or not? Especially when it deals with a grave health concern, most people, when they're acting reasonably and sound, when they're thinking with a sound mind, they would be like, yeah, this is something very serious, and I want to make sure that I'm referring to the one who has the best reputation, who has the most qualifications, who is attested to by the other experts as being the one who has the best expertise in this area. When it comes to a very important surgery, sure, if I'm just removing my appendix, and that's something very commonly done by many different surgeons, I may not be worried about it because they're all, or many of them would be able to do the same job, and it's pretty much, they all have the same quality of work when it comes to that. But when it comes to a very sensitive type of surgery that I know only very few surgeons in the world have had high levels of success in doing that type of a surgery, what would I do? Or when I know that it's a very grave type of procedure. This is a very important engineering project. This is a very important architectural project. This is a very important event that I'm planning. If it's something that is very grave and very important, a sound-minded person would be very careful and not just simply defer to just any expert. They would be very careful to make sure that they're getting the best possible work of expertise, because so much is at stake. And if, God forbid, something turned out to be going wrong later on, people of sound minds would blame us and say, why didn't you refer to the guy with the best reputation? Why didn't you refer to the guy with the best success rate? Why didn't you refer to the person that was known to be the best of the experts? Or at least somebody who you found was attested to by other experts as being better than the rest. This is one of the main reasonings why, when you know that the maraji' disagree on some issues, at least in those issues where they disagree, we should be referring to the one who has the best reputation of scholarship, the one who is known to be the more qualified amongst the rest, the one who has the testimonies of other experts as being the one who is the most qualified, the most learned amongst them. This is one of the lines of reasoning for why we're told that you should refer to the most learned, or why sound reasoning would say you should refer to the most learned expert. Okay, this is one line of reasoning. But if you remember 2 days ago I mentioned, there are two levels of discussion. One is the discussion that happens amongst those experts themselves. Those experts themselves disagree on this issue. They have their own discussions based on the scripture, based on the Quran, based on the hadith, based on reasoning. They use different lines of argument to argue for or against what I just mentioned. They start to say, some of them may say, look, yeah, maybe initially by default you should refer to the most learned expert. However, we find evidence in the Quran or in the hadith that says, no, you don't have to go to that extent. You can refer to just any expert. Some may argue for that line of reasoning. Others may say, no, we find evidence in the Quran and the hadith to the contrary. It confirms that we need to refer to the most learned expert when the experts disagree. And we can't simply refer to just any expert. So they have this own discussion amongst themselves, arguing for and against what I just mentioned. But the level for somebody who is not an expert, who doesn't have the tools to engage in that argument and discussion, we may be smart enough to follow the general outlines of what they're saying. We may have enough background and study if we've studied a little bit in the Hawza or studied a little bit of Islamic studies. We may be able to follow the general arguments that they're presenting. However, in order to make a judgment, a skillful judgment on their arguments, we need to have studied all the prerequisites that are required for those arguments. And that involves being able to evaluate whether a hadith is a hadith that has the credibility to be considered as evidence, and to know how to interpret the hadith, and to know how to reconcile it with other conflicting hadith. Also the same thing with the Quran. Also thinking about how to reconcile it with established usuli principles, so on and so forth. We need a certain level of expertise ourselves in order to take a position on their disagreement in that issue. So for most of us who do not have that level of skill, we're at the first level of discussion. So there are two levels of discussion. One that happens between the experts. Some of them take the position of saying you have to refer to the most learned. Some of them take a position of no, you don't. And then the first level of the discussion, as opposed to that level, is the level for the non-experts. You may and I may be an expert in something else. You may be a doctor. You may be an engineer. I may be studying to become a scholar in the academic study of Islam. But that is not the type of expertise that is required in this issue. So for this issue, for the relevance of this issue, we are non-experts. So if we are non-experts, how do we deal with the disagreement that they have on that topic? So this is where I left off 2 days ago, and now I'm going to give the answer. And let's contemplate together. You may have given this thought, you may have come to a conclusion. Maybe we agree, maybe we disagree. Let's think together. Here's the way a non-expert would approach such a topic. The non-expert has before him or her two things. A marja or a mujtahid who is known to be a mujtahid. He has reached the level of ijtihad. And another marja or mujtahid who is known to also have reached the level of ijtihad. However, he also has testimonies from other experts that say he is more learned than the rest. He is a'lam than the rest. So for me, as a non-expert, I know, because I have established that taqleed is allowed, as I explained earlier, I know that following the scholar, the mujtahid, who is the most learned, I'm sure that is okay. I'm sure it's okay. Because there's no issue about following the mujtahid who I know is also the most learned one. However, when it comes to the mujtahid who is not known to be the most learned one, although it's possible he could be okay for me to follow, because if that position is correct, then yeah, it would be okay for me to follow him. However, I am not sure. So, what am I before here? I'm before one option where I'm sure it's okay, and I'm before another option where I'm not sure it's okay. In order to make sure that I am safe on the Day of Judgment and in my choices, what should I do then? I should take the position where I'm sure I'll be okay. Sound-minded reasoning would say, take what you're sure is okay, and then if one day you find out that the other option is okay, then go ahead. If you find out that it's okay, then go ahead. But until you're sure the other option is okay, how are you safe to take that position? Yes, on the second level of discussion, which is amongst the experts, amongst the maraja themselves, they have their own excuses for what position they take. One marja may say, no, people don't have to follow the most learned, the a'lam. They can follow any mujtahid. Another marja would say, no, they have to follow the a'lam. They have their own justified positions because they have access to the evidence and the arguments and the proof. They can make their own excuse before God for why they take that position. But as for me, who is not an expert, I don't have that argument that marja has. I'm not an expert like him to take that position. So for me, at the first level, where the level of non-experts, by default, I have to side with the safe option, which is the position of following a mujtahid who is known to be a'lam, the most qualified. Okay. And the way that you could present this argument also is given in this format. It says, الشك في الحجية مساوق لعدم الحجية. When I'm not sure that this is an excusable position to take, then it's as if it is not an excusable position at all. The only excusable position is the one I am sure it's an excusable position. It's a hujjah upon me. When I know that the a'lam is okay for sure, because it's either that all the mujtahids are okay to follow, or that only the a'lam is okay to follow. So at the very least, following the a'lam, the most learned, is okay. But I'm not sure about following the rest. Is it okay or not? It could be okay, it could not be okay. So, for me to take an excusable position at this point in my life, as a non-expert, what position should I be taking? The position of siding with the one who is known to be the most learned. So, I need to do my research. Just as I did my research to figure out who was a mujtahid, who had reached the level of ijtihad, I also need to do my research to figure out who has reached the level of being called a'lam. Now, either the same way that I figured out that somebody was a mujtahid by their reputation in the hawza, by the testimony of two experts, just upright experts that say he is the a'lam, the same way that I found out that with those methods somebody was a mujtahid, I used that same process to figure out who is the a'lam. If I reach a point where I'm sure that fulan is a'lam, I reach the testimony of two upright experts that say Fulan, this person is the a'lam, then I'm set. I don't have to look further than that. I don't have to go and look for conflicting testimonies and look for people who disagree and, oh, why does that person follow somebody else? I don't have to go through all of that. All I have to do is make sure that I have reached an excusable position. I've done my research and I reached the person that I believe is the a'lam, is the one who is most qualified to be followed, and then that is an excusable position. I emphasize, it is about the process and not necessarily about the result. And this is why you can find there may be a diversity of people that are followed in the Shia community, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not excused because we disagree on who we follow. I am not trying to talk about who to end up following. I am emphasizing what would be the proper process of going about who we should follow, the process. As for the result, who you end up following, that's a different issue, and I'm not responsible for leading you to one result or another. I'm not even responsible for who my parents end up choosing, or who my spouse or my siblings or my children end up choosing. If I have children, God bless us all, inshallah. But the point is that we follow the proper process that becomes an excusable position to take before God. At the end of the day, may God bless all of our maraja, may God protect them all. They each have their own strengths, they each have their own contributions to society, to the Muslim community. However, we need to put forth our efforts to try our best so that we have an excusable position before God. It's not about reaching necessarily the same result, which marja we follow. It's about making sure that we've done the excusable research, taking the excusable process, so that it's a sound-minded approach and that it's an excusable position to take before God. If God asks us, why did you follow that person? Based on what evidence? Based on what testimonies of experts? You could say, well, I followed the testimony of that scholar and this expert in the hawza, that expert in this hawza. They said that fulan is a'lam. They said that he's the most learned. I followed their testimony. And I knew that all the maraja agree that the testimony of these two just experts, generally speaking, would be proof. And I didn't hear of conflicting testimonies, so I just followed the testimonies of those experts. Or you could say, well, I had enough clues that accumulated to reach that conclusion based on sound-minded foundations, and then I became content that this person is the a'lam, so I followed him. Or you can say, well, Allah, I didn't need to figure out who's the a'lam, because for the ones who were possibly the a'lam, I just took precaution amongst their positions. I tried my best to take precaution, and I never needed to figure out who exactly was the a'lam. It's up to you. But most of the time, the easier approach is to figure out, do your research to figure out who is the a'lam, who is the one who is the most qualified marja to be followed. Now, you may face some obstacles in this process. It's not necessarily the simplest thing you've done in your life. It is not difficult, it is not complicated. However, it requires a little bit of diligence, a little bit of effort. Like you would try to figure out who's the most qualified surgeon. You'd figure out who's the most qualified manager for a particular project. It requires some effort, some sound-minded principles that you're basing your evaluation on. It's not about my personal understanding, oh, I think that guy, he makes more sense than the other guy. I'm not qualified to evaluate their legal positions. I don't have the skill set to evaluate it. I need to ask the experts in the hawza, what do they think of that person's qualifications? Is he simply a mujtahid, or is he the most qualified mujtahid amongst all? Now, if you reach a point where you're not able to figure it out, you've asked, keep on asking until you can figure it out. There are some rare scenarios in which some people may not reach conclusions in this issue. If you reach those scenarios, then we can talk about the details there, because there are also detailed scenarios for some of the rarer cases where people aren't able to figure out who's the a'lam, or they figure out that some of them are at the same level, or so on and so forth. There are details beyond this. But I'm emphasizing on the basic principle of referring to the a'lam. Okay. What if we refer to the a'lam and he says, look, you're allowed to follow any mujtahid, you don't have to follow the a'lam. In that case, then, go ahead and follow whoever you want amongst the qualified mujtahids. Because the most learned marja would have said, you're allowed to follow any other one. Through that process, it makes sense and it's okay. Because the most qualified amongst them is telling you, you can follow anyone else amongst the mujtahids. If the most learned marja says so, then that's fine. And that's not necessarily a far-fetched scenario. Maybe one day that would be the case. It could be that one day one marja becomes the most learned marja and he says you're allowed to follow any other mujtahid. However, the point is we should be following the excusable process and position for the time being. Now, there's another issue that comes into focus on the issue of taqleed, which is, what about the life of the mujtahid? Does he have to be somebody who's currently alive, or can I refer to the scholarship of somebody who I access his rulings through his books, although he has departed this world, he's deceased? In a nutshell, the same reasoning that I described earlier about following the most learned marja applies here about following the living marja. Because amongst them, there are two levels of this discussion. One is the level that happens amongst the experts, and one is the level that is for us that are not experts in this issue. Amongst those experts, they disagree. Can we follow a deceased marja, or does he have to be a living marja? They disagree on this issue. Some of them say yes, some of them say no. Some of them argue from the Quran and the Hadith and reasoning that you can follow a living marja, you can follow a deceased marja. Some of them say no, you have to follow a living marja. They disagree on this issue. So for us who are non-experts, what do? The ones who say you can follow deceased marja, they're sure that it's okay to follow a living marja. The question is, can you follow a deceased marja? Because the default position is that the living marja is the one who's okay to be followed. But is it okay to follow somebody who's deceased or not? They disagree. So, for me, who is not an expert, I present the same kind of reasoning I presented earlier. If I follow the living, most learned marja, then I know that I'm okay. If I follow the living mujtahid, I know that I'm okay. But if I follow the deceased mujtahid, I'm not sure. So, I follow what I'm sure is okay, and I suspend judgment on what I'm not sure is okay. If the living mujtahid, who is the a'lam, the most learned living mujtahid, he says, you are allowed to follow the deceased marja, then I can go and follow the deceased marja. But if the living, most learned mujtahid says, no, you cannot follow the deceased marja, then I cannot follow the most deceased marja. That is the excusable position, because there is no disagreement on the fact that you are allowed to follow a living marja. The disagreement occurs on whether you're allowed to follow a deceased marja, period. So you take the position where you're sure about it. Okay. If that is clear, now you realize why they say those who used to follow Sayyid al-Khou'i, when he became deceased, when he departed this world, may God rest his soul, may God Qudisa sirruhu. Why do you think that people, they can't just stick to his rulings without referring to a living marja first? Many people who used to follow Sayyid al-Khou'i, when he died, what did they do? They referred to a living marja, who they believed is the most learned living marja, and then that most learned living marja tells them, are they allowed to follow Sayyid al-Khou'i or not? And that's why those who follow Sayyid al-Khou'i today, it's because they're referring to a living marja that allows them to stay following Sayyid al-Khou'i. Same thing with those who follow Sayyid al-Khumaini, who believe that Imam Khomeini was the a'lam at his time. If you believe that and you followed him, when he passed away, Qudisa sirruhu, you would also do the same thing. You need to refer to the most learned living marja on whether you're allowed to follow him or not. Same thing with any marja you follow today. May God prolong the lives of the maraja. If the marja dies today, may God prolong his life and protect him. And you want to know, am I allowed to continue following him because I used to believe he was the most learned marja? based on the testimonies of experts, based on all these clues that I gathered, based on sound-minded reasoning and sound-minded foundations, I believe this marja was the alim and he died. Now what? Can I still follow his rulings? The answer is, you need to refer to the living, most learned marja to know whether you can continue to follow the deceased marja or not. Now that that's clear, let's address some common misconceptions about taqleed. Very quickly, some people say, look, this idea of marja'iyya is a historical product. Since when did the Shia follow the central authority, alaykum assalam, of religious scholarship called this marja'iyya? Where did you guys get this from? This is a recent invention. It's not aged more than the past, at most, few hundred years. This doesn't extend to the time of the Imam. Some people might try to make this argument, describing marja'iyya as a historically contingent product. Well, the answer to this, dear brothers and sisters, and for this particular aspect of the argument is, the marja'iyya, regardless of the forms of management that it has taken, regardless of how centralized it has become for whatever historical reasons, the principle of taqleed is something else. The principle of referring to the most learned marja is based on the sound-minded reasoning I've been talking about in the past 2 days, 3 days. Especially culminating today. This is reasoning that is not historically dependent. It's not based on historical developments. It's based on sound-minded principles. It's based on the practice of sound-minded individuals. It's based on the dictates of sound reasoning. It's based on the inclination of human nature, that when you do not know, you refer to those who do know. And when you're not sure if following the most learned is the only okay option or not, you refer to the option that you're sure is okay. This is the principle of taqleed, and particularly taqleed of al-a'lam and taqleed of al-a'lam al-hayy, referring to the most learned living marja. This is not a historical product. This is based on sound-minded reasoning. Even if we were to take a time machine back 1,000 years and we were to explain it to people back then, it should make sense just as much then as it does now. Because this is based on sound-minded reasoning. This is not a historically dependent line of reasoning. That's one thing. Second thing, some may say, okay then, now that you've admitted perhaps there are some aspects of marja'iyya, if not taqleed, at least marja'iyya, this managing authority, this guiding authority, this administrative authority, this centralized or semi-centralized authority of marja'iyya, you admit perhaps that this hasn't always existed in this current form. Then, cannot we be open then for changes and developments and advancements in this centralized authority or semi-centralized authority in the future? The answer? Sure, why not? This depends on each marja''s own view and vision about how to administrate the affairs. It depends on his own vision and theory, or his own vision of, and based on the consultation of his body of advisors and experts about how exactly is the best way to administer affairs, whether it be financial or administrative, more generally speaking. So one marja may choose to administer in a different way. We may see in the future a marja who decides to make it look in a different way, shape, or form. They may choose to make a certain type of administration based on a body as opposed to a centralized figure, or they may change the way that they administer affairs. This is something that goes back to the wisdom and the expertise of the marja and the body of advisors that he consults for issues that are not particularly related to just deducing the laws and the rules. That's just my own kind of analysis of the issue. It seems that in principle there shouldn't be any issue with a possible change in the way, shape, or form that this leadership of or the managing of these affairs may look in the future. But that does not impact the very principle that we're talking about. The very principle that we have a marja'iyya, the very principle that we have a reference point that is the a'lam, that is the living expert, the living marja. Okay, one more very important issue, which is the notion of transparency. Some people may object to the way that the marja'iyya, the reference authority that we're talking about, whatever particular marja we follow based on this process, we call the marja'iyya, this semi or completely centralized authority of leadership of the Shia community, administratively, politically, financially. Some may say, where's the transparency? We want to see more transparency, especially in light of what we see here in the West, of the types of ways that transparency becomes such a way to make people more content and confident in the management that's taking place and in the way that funds are being processed and whatnot. Well, there are different things to consider here. First, remember, one of the main conditions of the marja you follow is adala. Being upright, of integrity, of adala. And of course, most of the time, this is of the highest degree of adala that you find in these leaders of our community, these maraja. So that should be one of the key factors to kind of dissipate any contention about how transparent they really need to be. If you're so confident in their adala, you don't need to necessarily have complete transparency or even semi-transparency, because you're trusting that they know best how to administer these affairs and they know best how to administer these financials. However, there may be another issue at stake. It's not simply an issue of whether you trust them or not. Sometimes there may be different cons, pros versus cons. Cons to being transparent about everything that they do. At the end of the day, confidentiality